Hi, my name is Bob Rankin, and for my first teaching assignment, I'll be looking at Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. The book of Colossians was written by Paul to believers in the city of Colossae, and the reason that Paul wrote this letter was to combat false teaching that had come into the church at this time. As we look at the overall structure of the book, we can break it down into two main sections. The first deals with the preeminence of Christ, especially the preeminence of Christ as being over and above human teaching, over and above human wisdom. We can see an example of this in chapter 1, verses 15 through 18, where it says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things were created. And in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent." While we can at times find things that seem good in human wisdom and in human teaching, no human teaching compares to Christ. As Paul seeks to combat this false teaching, this human teaching that was going on in Colossae, he does so by exalting Christ as preeminent. He doesn't just seek to put down the false teaching, but rather he seeks to show Christ as being superior to it. In the second section of the book, we see our response to the preeminence of Christ. So now that we've seen that Christ is preeminent, how should we be responding to that? How should we be responding to it on a daily basis? And as we turn to chapter 3, we can see that we are in the second section of the book. So we're specifically looking at how should we respond to Christ being preeminent. So now that we know Christ is preeminent, what should our response be? So in chapter 3, starting in verse 1, it says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." The theme of this passage is really that Christians should be seeking after Christ. Paul is very clear about where we as Christians should be focusing our attention. In verse 1, he says that we are to be seeking those things that are above. And then he clarifies that, saying, "Where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God." And then he repeats himself in verse 2, saying, "Set your mind on things that are above." And then he gives the negative side of that, saying, "Not on things that are on the earth." So Paul says where we should be focusing our attention. He clarifies where we should be focusing our attention. And he repeats that. And then he says where we should not be focusing our attention. It would seem that as Paul wrote this, he wanted it to be abundantly clear where believers should be focusing the attention that they give in their lives. This theme can be seen as progressing throughout the passage, starting in verse 1, where Paul gives the admonishment that we should be seeking after Christ, and then he repeats that in verse 2, again saying we should be focusing on Christ, or on things that are above, and then gives the clarification that we are not to be seeking those things that are on earth. In verse 3, we're given the reason for that focus, and that being that we are dead in our sin and alive in Christ. So before we were saved, before Christ saved us from our sin, we were trapped in sin. We were dead in sin. But now that we are in Christ, we have died to that former sin, and we are now alive in Christ. Romans chapter 6, verse 1 through 2 says, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it?" So we've already died to our sin, and now we are risen in Christ. Therefore, we must be seeking after Christ. And then in verse 4, we're given the outcome of this focus. What is the focus going to lead to? And that is a promise that we will be with Christ forever in glory. It says, "When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." So we will be with Christ forever in heaven as an outcome of our seeking after him, as an outcome of our salvation and our position in him. Paul Paul speaks to this theme in Philippians chapter 3, verse 14, when he says, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. This is a very applicable theme for Christians, for every believer who is in Christ. This theme of seeking after Christ should be our natural response to the love that Christ showed to us on the cross in forgiving us of the sins that we had, or that we still have. As it says in 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. In this passage, we're told to seek after Christ, to focus on Christ. But we can't even do that except for the fact that he has loved us, that he has sought after us. So because he sought us, then we can seek after Christ. As we look at the rest of chapter 3, we can see that verses 1 through 4 are really just the foundation for the rest of the chapter. Paul goes on to remind his readers of where they were before Christ in their sin, and then shows them where they should be striving to be in Christ now that they are saved, now that they are Christians. This is a passage that I seek to go back to as often, or a passage like this. As I get caught up in work or in school or whatever else is grabbing at my attention throughout the day, it is important to remind myself that I am to be seeking after Christ each and every day. While I may need to work at my job, I also need to remember that I should be working out my salvation with fear and trembling. While I may need to be learning in school and seeking to learn those things so that I can live on this earth, I also need to be remembering that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So each and every day, believers should be focusing on God, should be focusing on Christ, and seeking to be like him with every part of their lives. Thank you for watching this video, and have a wonderful day.